Good morning. People often ask me, how did you get to where you are? How did it happen? And I just want you all to know, I grew up in a little town in West Virginia, 400 people maybe on a good day, by the name of Lost Creek. And I also tell people that I went to school on the Muskrat Plan to college. And what that means is that my entire high school time and the first 2 years of college, my dad and I trapped muskrats on about 6 miles of creek, the Lost Creek, and I used the money from those muskrats to pay for my college education. And I graduated with no debt, which is, people just don't understand that, but if you grew up where I grew up, you would get a little better for it. I went on my first missions trip in 1980. I was in Haiti during the time that Ronald Reagan fired all of the air traffic controllers. Wasn't sure that I'd get home. And I had a great time on that trip, and I thought then that I would probably go on another one day, but the Lord saw fit that didn't happen until 1999. And that's when probably the ministry began, when we went to Kosovo for the very first time, and we were so touched by the children, many who had lost parents or grandparents or aunts or uncles, their belongings, their house. And we came home after the first trip and started buying many of the items like you'll see in the room next door and taking them back in dozens of, at that time, 70-pound duffel bags. You could pack a duffel bag to 70 pounds. And we took, I remember one time, 42 70-pound duffel bags, a ton and a half of stuff, as we call it. So my beginnings were very humble, and I hope I keep part of that as we go along the path. And I brought that up this morning because I want to talk to you about three things. I want to share with you about the Ukraine. I was in the Ukraine twice this summer, and both incredible trips. And then I want to talk about Operation Christmas Child, and then I'm going to share with you some thoughts from Matthew 5, verses 13 through 16. But I'm going to talk about a lot of numbers and a lot of things and things that we've done, things that we've been given. And I just want to be sure that you understand, I don't mean it as a brag at all. It's a blessing. I mean, when I get to talk about the shoebox stuff, I'll share with you some things that we were given. And the enormity of the gift was just so far outside of my bandwidth, it was hard for me even to say, sure, I'll take that from you. So let me start first by praying, and then I want to take a few minutes and talk to you about my trips to the Ukraine. Lord, we thank you this morning for the opportunity to share the things that you do in our lives and the others that are involved, just for the folks yesterday, Lord, for the boxes that they build and the questions that they ask. Thank you so much for them, and thank you for all the Operation Christmas Child volunteers all around the United States. There's some in this church this morning, and the others around the world who coordinate everything that's done. Just be with all of those. Help them to get their jobs done quickly and freely. And be with me as I talk this morning. In your precious name we pray. Amen. For over 20 years, my wife and I and many other adults visited a missionary couple in Kosovo by the name of John and Ruth Chestnut. And John and Ruth Chestnut are from Columbus, Pickerington actually, outside of Columbus. And they had a phenomenal ministry in Kosovo. I could spend the next 45 minutes just talking about all the different things that they did in Kosovo to bring people to Christ. And it was a privilege to go there and work with them and go into schools and hand out gifts and help distribute clothing and food and all the different things. And you know that I was in Kosovo well over 25 times over the last 25 years, and most of those trips were working with John and Ruth Chestnut. And last year I got an email from them saying that they felt that their ministry in Kosovo was, I guess, mature, that they felt that they were more in the way because their children had come up and they were doing ministry, and they had others. They had a pastor in the church now that they had started, and they were looking for something else to do. And their mission board earlier this year asked them to consider going to Prague to work with Ukrainian refugees. And shortly after they got to Prague, they emailed me and said, when can you come and when can you bring some people? And I said, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to the Ukraine? And they said, yes. And I said, I'll be right over. And so I went in June with a friend, Terry Van Arsdale, and in communicating with the Chestnuts back and forth, they said, can you bring medical supplies? And I said, well, what did you have in mind? And they said, well, we're not sure. So I sent a few emails, and the answer that I got back was Bleed Stop. It's a product. You can get it at the drugstore. It's a powder that you pour into a wound, and it helps the bleeding to stop. Bleed Stop and trauma tourniquets. And so the next day I got an email from John, and it said, we've done some investigation on our end, and there are two things we'd like for you to bring: Bleed Stop and trauma tourniquets. So I began looking on the internet for those two items, and of course there were dozens of vendors, and a box of Bleed Stop has 4 pouches in it and sells for about $15. There were some that were more, some that were a little less, but I searched, lined them all up and searched and found a vendor in Cleveland who sold me 100 packages, I think, for about $13 and shipped them to me. And then I found trauma tourniquets as well. So after I got the 100, I wrote back to the vendor in Cleveland and I said, I need more. I need like 500 more. And if I told you it was going to the Ukraine, could you help me? And he wrote me back and said, Nelson, first name basis already, my cost is $7.25. How about $7.50? So the Bleed Stop that I had just paid $13 for 100, I was able to buy 500 more for $7.50. And then the same thing happened with the trauma tourniquet. So Terry and I ended up with, I think it was 10 duffel bags, and we flew to Prague. And John and Ruth Chestnut picked us up at the airport, and we got up the very next morning and headed to the Ukraine. And I had no expectation. I just knew I was with John and Ruth Chestnut, and they'd survived this long. I thought I'd be good. And if I was going to die with them, that would be fine too. And we got to the border with Ukraine and had to sit there for hours, and crossed over into the Ukraine and drove to a town called Ivano-Frankivsk. And it's in the western part, far away from the war. And we stayed in a nice hotel there, and we met with several different church leaders and distributed, passed out the items that we had brought, and they were very, very grateful. And then we came home. So we were only actually over there about 5 days. But they said, when are you coming back? So I went back in August with 2 people. So there were a team of 3 of us. And I forgot, on the first trip, John emailed me and said that someone was sending me 500 solar Ukrainian Bibles. And I'm thinking, how am I going to get? And they were about 2/3 the size of your cell phone. That's all the bigger that they were. That was it. And they were packaged wonderfully, and they moved right into the duffel bags, and they were very, very happy for that. On the second trip, we took the same items plus 10 trauma kits. It's like a backpack, but it was full of everything: surgical scissors and gauze and all the things that they probably would use on the front. And after we got home, I got a picture, which I'm not allowed to show you, of 2 soldiers whose face was hidden, and they had written to our friend who had brought those trauma kits to them, and they said, actually, we have nothing. We are required to take care of ourselves by ourselves. We don't have a hospital. We don't have a medic. And these things were such a blessing. And they said, such a blessing. So I'm hoping to go back in January with a team of 6, counting myself, and I was able to send 2 pallets of items like we have next door, and we're going to build 1,300 gifts and let the local Ukrainian pastors take us to villages where the children have nothing, and we're going to be able to pass those items out. So I'm looking forward to that. And I have just 2 more short stories about my second visit to the Ukraine. Made our way through customs, and we had driven maybe, and I may have mentioned this the other night, but we drove 25 or 30 miles, and we came to a checkpoint, which none had been manned on the first trip at all. And a Ukrainian soldier came to the window and said, "Passports, please." And I had all the passports inside of each other, and John handed them to him, and he looked down and saw United States of America and handed the whole thing back to John and said, "You beautiful Americans, have a nice day." And they normally open all the passports and get down and look in the window and say, "You're Nelson, you're Ron," and he did none of that. And we drove about 15 seconds, and I said, "You know, there's not many countries in the world where you hear that anymore." And we all agreed that that was a true statement. So on the way back to Poland from trip number 2, we're waiting at the border. It's like 7 hours. We're in a line of traffic, I don't know how many hundred cars long. And we get right up next to the border, and you can see the border guards. And I see this beautiful red Cocker Spaniel dog. And he's just running around like he's lost. And I thought, oh my gosh, somebody's lost their dog. It's beautiful. I've got to do something. And I threw open the van door, and I'm calling for the dog, and he's running around me, teasing me, and he finally comes to my ankle, and I reach down for his collar to look to see if there's a name on it or anything, and there's no name. There's a leather collar and a metal plate, no name, and I was just getting ready to scoop him up and walk up and down the row of cars and say, "Is this your dog?" When I looked up, and there was a border guard standing there like this. And I said, "Oh, hello. Is this your dog?" And here it was the drug-sniffing dog. But he didn't have on any uniform. He didn't have on any identification. And the border guard laughed and took the dog and left me alone. But when I got back in the van, my friend said, "Oh, Nelson, if you'd have seen the look he was giving you until you started talking to him." And I said, "Oh my gosh, I almost got arrested in Ukraine." So those are my Ukrainian stories. I hope to have more. The people that we met there conducting ministry were just, the stories that they told was just hard to even understand. So I'd like to transition to Operation Christmas Child and talk a little bit about that, some numbers. Once a year, Operation Christmas Child does what they call an annual report. And it usually comes out in March or April. And up until this year, it was printed and would come in the mail. And I would always look forward to it because it was like one of their little PowerPoint, I think it's called PowerPoint, about all their different ministries, but it was usually 12, 14, 16 pages and chock full of pictures and wonderful stories. And one morning I was eating my oatmeal at the keyboard, and an email came up and said, the annual report. So I just I have it on my phone. First thing says, 2021 special report. And then you know whose picture comes next, Reverend Graham. And it says, in 2021, Samaritan's Purse continued to declare God's glory in more than 100 countries and territories through Operation Christmas Child, including among many unreached people groups at the very ends of the earth. We praise God that more than 9.1 million shoebox gifts were distributed to children in need at over 81,000 outreach events. 81,000. Every shoebox, this is from Franklin Graham, every shoebox represents an opportunity to reach one more child with the gospel of Jesus Christ. So that had me hooked. So I go down to the next paragraph, and it's headed, Reaching the Unreached. You hear much talk today in our denomination and other churches about reaching the unreached peoples of the world. And this is what I read. And this is true. This is hard to believe. In Gabon, which is in Africa, the Baka people live on the margins of society and have typically been outside the reach of the gospel. But that began to change when shoeboxes were given out in a remote village. All 354 children in the community turned out for the festive outreach event, and all the adults too. So it had to be 800 to 1,000. Everyone listened carefully as they heard the gospel for the first time and discovered how much God loved them. At the end of the presentation, all of the children and all of the adults prayed to receive Jesus as their Lord and Savior. And I've been coming here for 6 years and saying roughly 4 out of 10 recipients sign up for the Greatest Journey, and half of those, or 2 out of 10, pray to receive Christ. And here's an example where everyone in the village chief, who also gave his life to Christ, was so impressed with the event that he set aside some land for a church to be built. Praise God. Isn't that great? So we're going to build 1,000 shoeboxes today. Just imagine if every one of those prompted a young person to come to the Lord. So give me a second to go down to the end, because there's a follow-up and I don't want to forget it. Okay. Earlier, we told you how an entire village among the Baka people in Gabon gave their lives to Christ after hearing the gospel for the first time. But that's not the end of the story. Everyone in the community was so eager to learn more about Jesus that they wanted to immediately begin the Greatest Journey, the 12-lesson Bible course for shoebox recipients. Several teachers then led hundreds of villagers through the first lesson. But at the end, they all wanted to continue. They were so hungry to learn more about God's love that they insisted on going through all 12 lessons in just a few days. That's phenomenal. So that's my shoebox story. I want to share with you talking about gifts that were just so big I still can't even wrap my arms around it. There's an organization in Oklahoma that connects people like me to companies that want to move product and give it away and write it off on their taxes. And this organization in Oklahoma, I don't get nearly as much stuff from as I do the one in Illinois, but about every 12 to 18 months I'll get an email or a phone call, and there'll be a company in New Jersey or New York that has a pallet of this or a pallet of that. So about 2 months ago, I got a phone call from my contact there, and he said, you know the company in New Jersey, it's in Fair Lawn, about an hour and a half from me. They have, I think he said in the beginning, 8 pallets. They have 8 pallets of product that they'd like for you to pick up. And this was Thursday. My truck was absolutely full to the door. And he said they'd like for you to be there tomorrow before noon. And I said, okay, tell them I'll come get it. And I had some friends help me Friday morning early unload my truck, and then I headed to New Jersey. Well, when I got to New Jersey, it wasn't 8 pallets. It was 11 or 12 pallets. And I got, I think 8 or 8.5 of them in my truck. And my mom says I can put 10 pounds in a 5-pound bag. So I did my best. And then I said to the lady, can I come back on Monday? And she said, sure, come back on Monday. So Monday morning I go back, and they didn't have 12 pallets. They had 16 pallets. And I loaded my truck a second time and I think I got it all in that time. So that was load number 2. and got back to the warehouse and got it unloaded. And about 3 days later, my friend in Oklahoma called me again, and he said they have more. And I went back a third time, and then I went back a fourth time. So the total was somewhere between 24 and 25 pallets. And I know you're sitting there thinking, well, what in the world was it? Well, they sell young girls' jewelry. And a lot of it was licensed Disney product. On the table, you'll see on the far corner over here, there's some hair pins, really nice hair pins that say Disney. And on the back, they say $12.50. And I got thousands of those. And then there's charms and pins, and those boxes are just right on down. And there's tens of thousands of those. And my guess is that the entire, as we would say at home, kit and caboodle is probably worth $750,000 to $1 million. And we started out, I usually pay this organization in Oklahoma $150 a pallet. And that's what they get to help keep their lights on and, connect me with this company. And we started talking about, well, that's an awful lot of money. And I said to him, since for me it's the donation of the year, why don't I just give you $2,022 and we'll call it a day? And he said, that'd be great. So for all that product, and we've already used probably 20% of it, I paid $2,022. And that's where the money that we receive goes. So that's one. And then there's a company in Mechanicsburg called Raymond Geddes, and they sell school supplies. And most of them are sold online. And somehow I got connected with them 10, 12 years ago and made friends with the dock manager at their warehouse in Mechanicsburg. And my boss was with me one day. I asked him to ride with me one day because we really hadn't gotten a chance to get to know each other. And I took him to Raymond Geddes. And the items that I picked up probably were no more than 15, that I had ordered were no more than 15 to 20% of my truck. And so we got that all loaded and we're getting ready to leave. And my friend at the dock, Scott, came to the door and looked in my truck and said, oh, Nelson, you've got all kinds of room in there. We're going to fill you up today. And I said, oh, what did you have in mind? And he said, pencils. Now, can you imagine my whole truck full of pencils, how many million that would be? I'm thinking, one, we're going to be over the weight limit, and how am I going to drive it home? Well, to make a long story short, they're very nice pencils, and they also are in the room next door. They were scented, and the reason they gave them to me were that a few of the pencils didn't quite smell the way they wanted, and so they were just going to throw them away. And Scott said, no, I'll give them to Nelson. And they come 72 in a box like that, and I went online and looked, $79 for 72 pencils. And I got 62,500 of those pencils. It filled my truck. My boss kept saying, how are we going to get this all in here? I said, well, if you have to walk, but we're taking all these pencils. And we got them all. And those are two of the biggest giftings, and they both happened this summer. And, they happen on a day where, for some reason, you begin to think, well, maybe I should retire, or maybe, I'm doing too much, or you're down on yourself, and you get an email like that, and you say, Lord, wow, I guess I need to keep going. So I think I mentioned last year, my goal is to get to 500,000. And I want to explain to you, and this is part of the I'm not bragging part. This is just what I'm hoping to get to. If you use those percentages that I mentioned earlier, the 40% and the 20%, if I could get to 500,000 before Jesus takes me home, or I have to quit for physical reasons, that would mean that roughly 200,000 young people would have taken the Greatest Journey Bible class as a result of all the crazy stuff that we've collected and put in a box. better than that, that would mean that 100,000 young people would have prayed to receive Christ. And an untold number of adults, because they say that the Greatest Journey book is read 9 to 11 times before it comes to rest. 9 to 11 times. And many of those readings are by parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles, which is just fabulous. And you may be sitting there thinking, well, where are you now? By the end of this year, I should be somewhere around 345,000. Today will get me to 30,000 for this year. And this is a phenomenal, this has been really a phenomenal year all around. But I think I can get to 500,000 in the next 5 to 6 years. And by the time if I do get there, around that time, the ministry overall should be at 250 million. They're right at 200 million now, and it grows about 10 million a year. So if I could get to 500,000 in 5 or 6 years, the ministry would be at 250 million, and it would be pretty cool to have done 500,000 of the 250 million. So that's why I run around like a crazy man buying pencils and notebooks and all the stuff that we do. And I appreciate, your support. All the money that you give us is used for the ministry. It's not used for our personal expenses. So in the few minutes that I have left, sorry, brother, I want to share with you some thoughts on Matthew 5, and I'm going to read verses 13 through 16. This is one of my favorite passages in the entire Bible. I have a short list of like 5, and this is one of those 5. It says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." Have any of you ever been to the Wells Fargo Center in Philadelphia to a game? Anybody? Imagine for a moment that Pastor Herb and I go to the Wells Fargo Center, and he has a really good seat, and he's right on the court side, down the court, and I have the worst seat in the house, and I'm in the crow's nest at the very top. And right before the ball game starts, all the power goes out, and there's no generators, there's no nothing. It would be so dark in there that you would not be able to see your hand in front of your face. And then Pastor Herb remembers that he has a farmer's match. Anybody remember farmer's matches? They would light on anything. They had to finally quit making them because the mice would chew on them and start fires in people's homes. But when I grew up as a Boy Scout, we had farmer's matches. And they would light on wood, they would light on anything rough. So he, in an effort to figure out what's going on, he lights his match down on the floor. I'm clear at the top. Do you think I would see that match? I would. I may not have heard it because my hearing's not the greatest, but I would have seen it. And that's us. That's you and I and all the other Christians in the world, in our world today. The title of my brief message is "Turn on Your Light and Pass the Salt." Turn on your light and pass the salt. Why is this passage so important? I don't need to tell you that the world that we live in is dark and getting darker by the day, probably darker by the minute. And if you're here today and have a relationship with Jesus, we are it. I mean, we are it. Look around. There are other churches and there are other people that know Christ, but as Christians, it's our responsibility to be a light in that dark world. So where do we start? If we're going to be a light in this world, where do you think you would start? I picked your neighbors, our neighbors, my neighbors. Galatians 5:14, the latter half of it says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And I wish my wife were here this morning to help me with this story, but neighbor story. A lady and her boyfriend moved in next door, and the lady was divorced and had 2 daughters, one about 9 and one about 12. And they've lived there for about a year, and then last summer at some point there was some friction, and I don't know if the boyfriend decided to leave or if the girlfriend kicked him out, but he departed. And then the woman got depressed and began to drink. And that made it hard for the girls. And every now and then our doorbell would ring, and there would be the girls. And the first night, Robin said, come in, let's bake a cake. And she took them into the kitchen, and she got out the pots and pans, and I was in the other room doing something, but they baked the cake, and then they iced the cake, and then they talked, and then they ate the cake. And since that time, when the girls need to be away and feel safe, the code word is, can we bake a cake? They ring the doorbell, and they bake a cake. And they've gotten pretty good at it, honestly. But that's us, primarily my wife, reaching out to and being a light to the neighbor. And occasionally, the mother will come and ring the doorbell. And she's usually feeling pretty good and wants to moan and carry on about her situation. And Robin will go out and sit and listen and put her arm around her. And then she'll say, you need help. And that's what I think the salt is. You can have your light on, but you have to wait for the right opportunity to say, you need help. You need to go to rehab, and you need Jesus. So once we've reached our neighbors, where do we go next? I think we should go to the community, the people outside of the neighbors. Think about who you interact with within a week. Your doctor, your barber, your dresser, your bank teller, your grocery store cashier. Do they see your light? I've had many of those people that I've come in contact with that I've gotten the shoebox bills. You know, one of them, like the nurse at the doctor's office, will say, oh, how was your weekend? What did you do? Ding, ding. And begin to talk about it, and they'd say, oh, I'd come to that. We've actually even gotten our neighbors, the ones I just talked to you about, to come to shoebox builds, and they said that they would come anytime. So neighbors, community, and beyond. Acts 1:8 says, you shall be my witnesses both in Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria. What about all the people you talk with on the phone, through your job? They may be in Oklahoma, or they may be, my friend in Oklahoma, I don't think he's a Christian, the one that calls me with all this wonderful stuff. And I talk to him very openly about why we do what we do and where the product's going, and those kind of things happen. I know they happen for you every day. So how do we step it up? How do we maybe do a little better job than we have been doing? Be friendly with people whenever you can. Be sincere. Be caring. We have a habit, and it's just not in America. It's everywhere I've been. People greet each other with, how are you? But it's just, how are you? Fine. How are you? Fine. And that's all there is. And so I've gotten to the point where I wait and then say, now tell me, really, how are you? And you will not believe what that opens up. I've had grocery store cash register people say, I've been down in the back, and then I can say, well, can I pray for you about that? Can I add you to my prayer list? I have a minister friend in the valley who I've had lunch with or breakfast several times, and after the waitress or waiter brings the food, before he walks away, he says, I'm going to bless this food before we begin to eat it. Is there anything that I can pray for you about? And I've been shocked. They've all had something for him to pray about. One lady walked away and walked about 6 or 8 steps, stopped and turned around and came back and said, thank you for asking me. My son's being deployed in South Korea in the DMZ. Only because he asked. Sorry. So, what if I've never done this before? Or I've tried it and I'm not very good at it? One, I think you should pray that God will show you who to be a light to. That's a good start. Number 2, ask for help. And I didn't ask him if I can say this, but I would think that your pastor is a master at talking to other people and getting them to share what's on their heart. Ask for a mentor in the church here to help you with it. And just continue to pray. And the Lord put a car analogy in. All the new cars have what I would call running lights. So when you start your car, the little running lights are on regardless of the time of day. And I think we as Christians should have our lights on all the time. And when it gets dark, we turn the other lights on. And when it gets really dark, we put the high beams up. We just need to be on the alert all the time for somebody that you might be able to minister to that really needs you, and we have walked by that person untold numbers of times. So later today, we're going to fill 1,000 shoeboxes, and that's going to be a light to 1,000 young people and probably many adults with your help. And I'm going to show a video in a second, but I'm going to do something I didn't really plan to do. All of you know Billy Graham. I know you know Billy Graham. And I was in Ohio one weekend visiting my mom, and we were watching kind of a consortium of different pieces of Billy Graham's ministry and George Beverly Shea's ministry, and it was just excellent. I mean, it was excellent. And one night in the middle of his sermon at a big revival meeting in some big stadium, he stopped. And George Beverly Shea was over here, and is it Cliff Barrow? Cliff Barrow here? And he looked over at George Beverly Shea and he said, I think we should sing. And he looked over at Cliff Barrow and he said, I think we should sing. And you could see Cliff Barrow looking at George Beverly Shea like, this wasn't planned. So George Beverly Shea said to Billy Graham, what would you like to sing, brother? And he said, the only song I know. And he walked out from around the pulpit, and George Beverly Shea joined him here, and Cliff Barrow joined him here, and Billy Graham put his finger in the air and he said, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.